So we're right at 11:15. So those of you that are coming in, you keep coming in, and there are some spots available. Otherwise, this bodes well for you, Rob, that they're standing room only at your talk.
Yeah,
we should take some pictures of the audience so you have proof.
Yeah.
So thank you. So I'm doing this is the first year I can't read without cheaters now, so I'm doing this all the time. What I love about this is there's a few people in the room that are laughing, so they're experiencing the same thing. Not everybody here is 30 years younger than I am, which lets us know how far we've come in the game development world. So I'm the chair of the conference. You'll see me throughout the day. This is always an exciting conference for me because I come from academia, so I'm really like an educational game designer. And I remember very early on I had this experience. I did this beta for like 7 barely workable games for like $12,000 from the CEO of the company that I worked for, and they were just like proof of concept, give me money. And he said, this was like 7 years ago, and he said to me, why doesn't this look like Madden football? And I said, sir, $12,000, $300 million. And he said, okay, and he gave me $1 million. So he didn't. I was hoping for like 30, but I took $1 million. So anyway, thank you all for crowding in. It's just really exciting to see. It's minus something. It's February, and it's Madison, and we've got standing room only. So this is Robert Howard from Purdue Polytechnic, so maybe that's why I'm introducing you like academic to academic. So Rob began his journey in the video games by trying to combine his love for music, sound, and games as a freelance sound designer. After completing one contract, Rob realized his passion for development extended beyond audio and entered SMU's prestigious Guildhall program as a level designer. After graduation, Rob worked on such titles as BioShock, Batman, there's too many to go through here. Prey, all during his 5 years at Human Head Studios. So Human Head and some of the local studios, you guys are all way too humble. You wouldn't know that all these titles. So for instance, Brian Pelletier, who also Human Head and now Bethesda, he will never tell you this, but he's the WJ president. He worked on Wolverine and Star Trek Next Generation, two the still top grossing games of all time. So you guys are among greatness, and I'm sure there's people in this crowd that are like, I should just be in awe, but you're all too humble. So many things, and let's see. After working for 3 years in Silicon Valley for the 21st Century Fox and Disney at Cold Iron Studios, Rob was appointed to the faculty of Purdue University in 2019. He's now a professor of practice in the Computer Graphics Technology Department, teaching game design, level design, and game audio. He also taught at Madison Media Institute in Madison. I remember that. They tried to recruit me right out of high school in Wisconsin from 2013 to 2016. So welcome, Rob, and I'm in awe of like how far we've come in the Madison community and Wisconsin community. So take it away.
All right. Thank you. All right, well, welcome. I am blown away by this audience here. I was telling Joe Reedy here that when you do something like this, you think, 5 people, 10 people. So this is a extremely pleasant surprise. A lot of faces I recognize here, which I very much appreciate. So thank you for coming. All right, so my talk, I like gimmicks. I think designers like gimmicks, and as such, I've kind of formatted this in the style of a game. And this is our loading screen, where you might display some tip for the game or some kind of blurb. And in this case, we're just going to talk about why you should care about this talk. And I look at this large audience, and I'm like, I really hope you care about this talk. I think level design in particular is looked at as an instinctual sort of art, a learn by doing art, that maybe there's not a lot of theory behind it or best practices or pillars or what have you. And my experience, both in industry and from teaching, says that that's not true. There's actually a lot of things that you can apply to make your level design better, to make it more effective, to make it more interesting. And so the purpose of this talk today is to kind of discuss what those things are, what things I've learned throughout my experiences in the industry that I can hopefully then pass on to you, whether you are a student in a game development studio now, in a indie studio, whatever your situation may be, if you're an educator, and so on. All right, so the first level of our fake game here, and this is almost rendered unnecessary because I didn't know I'd get such a lovely introduction. And you're definitely right about the humility of the developers here. So it was actually just a little bit embarrassing to hear all of that. So I'll kind of skim through some of this. All right, so as was mentioned, I kind of started out wanting to get into audio. My bachelor's degree was in music performance. This has stayed with me through my whole career. Even at Human Head, this was true. I did a lot of audio work there. But through that, I realized, hey, I like the whole thing. I like all of it, right? And so level design just made a lot of sense for me to try to do. Because of that, I went to SMU Guildhall way back in 2008, got a master's of interactive technology there, and yeah, I've been super fortunate to work for and with a number of great companies. Some are gone, like Vicious Cycle and Irrational. Some are still here and they've changed forms, like Human Head into Roundhouse, and of course Warner Brothers very much still around. Epic, obviously, more than ever still around, and Cold Iron is still trucking, working on their game, and now they're owned by Scopely. So they've had about 5 different owners or whatever it is. They've been passed around quite a bit. All right, and again, this is a little redundant now, but just some notable games. Since it was already kind of mentioned, I'll just kind of gloss over this just a bit. Of course, BioShock is the one that everyone brings up, in whether it's job interviews or people off the street or friends and family. So I guess my advice to all of you is if you get a chance to work on a game like that in any capacity, and I don't care what it is, if you're painting dinosaur toenails or fetching coffee for people, you want to do it because it just kind of opens doors. In a sense, I wish that wasn't true because it should be your work, your talent, but, it's a big deal. But yeah, Prey 2, just really proud of that work, and seeing some of my friends that I worked with on that brings back a lot of memories. And I just want to mention quickly Lost Within, because it's sort of the game I worked on that I like the most, that the people out there know the least, kind of. It was a really cool survival horror game that we did at Human Head for Amazon. I thought we did a great job. It was a lot of fun to work on, and you can get it on your iDevices and tablets, right now. So I always like to mention that one. Deserves some love. All right, so in 2013, I kind of decided to happily overextend myself and teach at the now defunct Madison Media Institute here in Madison. And really, those classes were meant for sort of art, sort of hard surface modelers and so on. And they needed someone to come in and teach how to get their assets into game engines, right? And so I just made those into level design courses because I figured, well, they'll learn how to do that, the art asset importing, but they'll also get a lot more out of it. And I had a great time. And through that experience, I kind of had it in the back of my mind that, hey, I might want to do this full-time someday. I didn't think it would happen right away simply because I had a big list of requirements in my head. It had to be a big prestigious state school, had to be close to my family if I was going to do that. And I thought, that's never going to happen. But life is funny. As it turned out, there was an opportunity at Purdue. It's outside of the scope of this talk to discuss that process of getting hired there in depth. I'll just say completely different than getting a game dev job. Very, very different. So different that after I was done interviewing there, I came back to California where I was at the time, and I just thought, well, that's nice. That probably didn't happen. And then it did because I had no idea how college hiring works. Totally different vibe. So yeah, I've been teaching there since August, absolutely loving it. Students are great, even when they find a typo on my portfolio that's existed for 4 years, which happened actually this past week. But they are wonderful. And I find that as an educator, I spend just about as much time in the tools in Unreal or whatever as I did I was working in industry. It's just in the context of teaching a class. All right, so the next level of my talk is my level design education. I thought it would be good to talk about what I learned both before I went to SMU and after I went to SMU, and kind of how that has shaped my kind of level design discipline throughout my life. So before college, back in the early 2000s, I really had no idea what I was doing. And this is, I think, what a lot of people think level design probably is, right? It's free form. You learn by doing, get into the editor, just start making. And of course, that's great. Of course, you should do that. But of course, it's pure design on the fly. And so you might get things that are functional, but they aren't going to be very good. So there's really no surprise that I didn't get anywhere. I would apply for jobs here and there when I would see them come up, and I would just hear nothing. And not surprising looking back. The kind of tools I was using, Neverwinter Nights, the 1999 or so BioWare Neverwinter Nights, and yes, Unreal 2, not 4, not 3, but 2 was what I started on. But fortunately, it was enough to pass SMU Guildhall's entrance portfolio requirement. I'll just comment, they were way ahead of their time back then. Approaching level design is a thing you can even teach at all, much less at the master's level, which is what their program is. So what kind of things did I learn from SMU, or what were some really important things that I can pass on? So the big thing is never design on the fly. Now, there's lots of things I learned from SMU, but if I could bake it down into one thing, it would be that. Now, what do I mean by not design on the fly? It really means that you have a process where you're getting ideas out of your head and onto something else before the editor, right? So usually that means paper design phase, doing a level design document or something, doing a white box in the editor where you're just laying out basic forms. And for some of you, this would seem like, gosh, Rob, no, duh, of course that's what you do, right? I mean, that's just obvious. But I'll tell you that, all the studios I've worked for and with, sometimes those processes are skipped or truncated. This didn't really happen at Human Head. I'm going to say it because there's Human Head people here, Roundhouse people. So I don't want them to think I'm being critical, because that didn't happen there. But at other places I've worked for and with, it did. And the results are not good. You have to do that stuff. You have to create, I like to think of it as the straw man, and that's what the paper design is, the document is. It's not a law that you follow forever, but it's just a thing that you can use to start making those big, important decisions, the big edits, the big changes that you want to make early. I think it's less important for this talk, but I'll just say that I think SMU, and this is something we're striving to do at Purdue as well, did a really good job teaching me about typical studio practices, whether it's source control, working in teams, a lot of things that aren't necessarily design theory, but kind of helped me hit the ground running at game studios. All right, so the next level here, what I've learned from industry, going back to my days at Vicious Cycle and then at Human Head and Cold Iron and so on. All right, so the thing I wanted to say is I've had some amazing mentors in my career. These were like teachers that I had after college, and I hope you all have great mentors too. Now, not just these three people. I've had many more mentors than that, but I kind of wanted to limit it to kind of level design people specifically. And so I kind of narrowed it down to three folks, and I wanted to kind of impart to you what I learned from them, because these people kind of form the basis of what I've brought to the classroom in my own teaching. All right, so Brett Freese, he was a level designer at Vicious Cycle, kind of my direct colleague there, direct supervisor, if you will. And he was an architect, which is common enough for architects to become level designers, but it was the first time I had really encountered someone with that training. And so what I learned from Brett is the study of architecture, particularly level layouts. It's very useful for that. And if there's just one book that you should all get, there's many books, of course, that have been written on this, both architecture and even now level design and architecture, such as Christopher Totten's book is very good. But this book right here, Architecture, Form, Space, and Order by Francis D.K. Ching is the tome. It is the great source of wisdom for basic kind of architectural design and thinking. It does an amazing job in the first few chapters of breaking down the basic elements of form. So talking about you take a point in space, and even just a point in space makes you feel different about an environment. You extend a point to get a line, and you can organize your levels around linear concepts, and you can extend a line to make a plane, and then a plane becomes a volume, and it just builds and builds and builds. And you'll just look at space differently just by reading those chapters. But then when you're done with that, and this is where the book really becomes valuable and where I've used it throughout my career, is, when you're doing level layouts, especially, this was definitely true at Cold Iron. I'd be doing a couple of white boxes a week. You're just cranking out content, and it's so easy to get into patterns of like boxy room, hallways connecting them, just the kind of stale things that we level designers can get into sometimes. What this book is great for is just open it up in the middle or somewhere randomly, and there'll be these incredible architectural sketches of all kinds of layouts, from cathedrals to municipal spaces, parks, whatever. And the author has given just tremendous explanations for why these spaces are unique. It's not just pictures, but then there'll be an explanation of, hey, this is designed with volumes, like this building is just volumes stacked in interesting ways, or whatever it is. And so this is a great kind of inspiration machine, basically. So I go back to this book all the time. All right, so Nathan Cheever, I worked with him at Human Head, and he's kind of a different animal as a level designer. He's really more of what I would call a world designer, which is kind of a unique sub-discipline. And I really learned about world design through working with Nathan, on Prey 2. And he really taught me to focus on the world. And what that means is there's this word that I love, and I love big fancy words. Maybe it's why I'm teaching at a college now. The word verisimilitude. I just love that word, and it just means realism, basically. And what I learned from him is, when you're making a level, you're really making a world, and you want that world to have verisimilitude, realism. Now, what does that mean in practice, right? It means that, hey, if you walk up to a light switch, maybe you can switch it on and off, and you can actually do that. Maybe if it's a city environment, you actually try to make a facsimile of a working subway system. It doesn't matter if it's just you press a button, the screen fades, you teleport to another area, and that was your subway ride. It still helps to generate that verisimilitude. It's why some of my favorite games, like I love the Yakuza games, for instance, that whole series, because they nail that, the verisimilitude, through a whole bunch of really simple systems. And Nathan's crusade throughout his career is trying to get that focused on early. A lot of these things get focused on near the end of projects. It's kind of flavor that gets added. He's always pushing to get these things introduced in your pre-production, get someone working on world design right away, because it's different than moment-to-moment gameplay. It's different than, as important as that is, it's a different thing than hit trigger, enemies spawn, battle enemies, all that stuff. And the other thing I learned from Nathan is really just to pay attention to the tools I'm using and how I'm using them. At Human Head in particular, he was always really driving towards the improvement of our tools. And I think my habit before that was to kind of let the tools basically use me, right? Like however the engine I'm working with, if it does a certain thing, I'm just going to do that. I'm not going to try to customize the settings or change it. Or if you're in a situation where you have a tools engineer, maybe make suggestions, work with them to try to make the tools better. That just has such a huge impact on the workflow and development of a project. All right, so this is kind of one of my favorite moments in game development, and I've probably driven people nuts in job interviews and things with this. If anyone knows me, they'll be like, the barrel story again. I've heard this 100 times, but maybe you haven't. So this is definitely one of those direct, hey, like I learned this from one of my mentors, and now here's like an application in a real game, right? So we're working on Bioshock Infinite. And this was kind of a section of the game that a lot of us were working on. the Thinkton section in the middle, and I noticed there's all these barrel fires. This was late in the project. We were just basically fixing bugs at this point. And I thought, hey, do I take damage when I stand on this? No, I did not take damage. So what did I do without telling anybody, without asking, permission? I just went in there and put little tiny damage volumes on all those barrels. They don't kill you instantly. It takes a while. You have to stand there for a few moments at least to get your health all the way down to zero. I was good. I made sure I attached them to the barrels, so if some artist came in and moved the barrel, there wouldn't be this damage that would just happen in space, right? Right. So I thought ahead a little bit. But why this is one of my favorite moments in game development is, it just makes the world there a little more real because you get just that bit of feedback, because you would expect that standing on fire would hurt. And also it's a favorite moment because, I snuck something into a Game of the Year, multi-million seller, right? And so, of course, you gotta love that. All right, so Mike Flynn, what did I learn from Mike Flynn? So he's a level scripter, so it's more of the programming end of the level design discipline. So with Mike, I remember what would happen, once again, at Human Head is I'd be scripting stuff. I remember in particular on Lost Within, which was a lot of C# scripting. And Mike is very exacting, very detail-oriented. Like he really thinks about how your code, how whatever you're making is going to be looked at by other people. And so he really strives to be organized. And where I was at that time in my career is I was not that way. I was sloppy and bad with things like that. Again, sorry, Ryan Smith, anyone else that had to look at my code back then. But Mike just had, a really great way of, kind of scooting over to my desk and sitting down and just very nicely saying, hey, clean up your stuff, and so, the thing I learned from that is to really think of what you're making as a product. And I don't mean as a product in the sense of a packaged game you buy in the store or what you download from Steam. I mean, it's a product that's going to be used by other developers, like what you're making, if it's a scripted object, a level, whatever it is, it's going to be encountered by other people, even if that other person is just you, right? If it's a solo project and you just set it down for a few months and pick it back up again, if you didn't take great care to be detail-oriented with how you write your scripts and kind of make your game objects, it's going to be even confusing to you later. And this is definitely something I bring into the classroom now, because obviously when you're dealing with 30 students at a time in a class, if they're not organized, it makes it very difficult. So that's really something I picked up from Mike. All right, so this is a great place to have a checkpoint here, a save point. Now, I hope I survive this talk and I don't have to respawn here at this point. But I just wanted to take stock of what we've learned so far. So these are the key takeaways before we get into the teaching portion of this talk. So have a process. Don't just design on the fly. It's kind of one of the big ones right there. Something that, believe it or not, I actually think is still kind of a problem sometimes, even in the industry. Using architecture as a means to inspire different ideas. Verisimilitude of your worlds and how that's as important as the moment-to-moment gameplay, however that bakes down to your project. And then finally, be detail-oriented in your scripting. Think of it as a product with end users. Okay, so what I've learned from teaching, which I think is actually pretty unique. I think teaching kind of puts you in a kind of a special place you don't get into normally in the industry. And so what I mean by that is when you think about what you end up doing as a teacher is you're sort of like a design lead in a lot of ways, right? And in the industry, maybe you become a lead level designer at some point, or a lead designer or a creative director, and who knows, maybe that means you're in charge of 5 people, 10 people, 15 people, who knows. It could be a lot, could be a little, but when you're teaching, you're in charge of a lot of people, right? I mean, my first class at Purdue was 30 students. I probably have at least 70, 80 students this semester in my classes just in total. And you're just cranking them out every semester. So you really get a lot of, I think, unique experience that I think and hope is pertinent to other situations, even outside of the classroom. Okay, so things I've learned from teaching. The better the documentation, the better the end result. So when I have students do paper design, like a level design document, and by the way, I don't require insane level design documents. This is one of the things at Guildhall, they always have you doing 30, 40-page level design documents, and I found out right away in the industry no one cares. So that's just not that's not helpful, right? So I don't mean huge tomes. But what I like is, look, for a level that's done in my class, 3 to 5 pages, a lot of bullet points, maybe a good set of illustrations, some references. So we're not talking something that's enormously involved, but the students that nail that documentation, and I think this is near 100%, even going back to my teaching at MMI, their end results are great. If the documentation's great, the end result is great. I think the only variance I can think of is maybe a paper that I give a B+ to, or a B, maybe they'll end up with an A project, but never, I can't think of one time where I got like a C- design document and they just nailed the final project a few months later was an A. It just doesn't happen. And I think the great insight, especially for industry, is that, hey, design tests work. And that's a relief because, especially at Cold Iron, I authored design tests. I would give them out. I would grade them all the time. And you always have that little voice in the back of your head, because most design tests in the industry don't have you go in the editor. Sometimes you do, but most of the time it is documentation based. So I'd always think, is this BS? Am I really figuring out this person's a good designer because they gave me, a good looking document? Well, I can tell you through my classroom experience, yes, it probably does mean they're a good designer, which is a great relief. I think there's, other means we can determine their hard skills. We can check out their resume, we can interview them. But at a basic level, the quality of the documentation is a wonderful predictor of the quality of the design that you're going to get. So I've gotten some really good experience in giving feedback to people, right? Because as a professor, you get projects, you get projects turned in. We typically have, 4 or so milestones or checkpoints on a level design project. And so what I've learned is you should demand big changes early. All right, so what happens with student work, and I think it's probably the same thing with professional work as well, is that you look at that first white box or even the paper design somewhere early like that, and there's something about it that bugs you, right? And I'll just use a very simple example, because students do this kind of thing all the time. They give me something that's way too big. Right, they give you something that's supposed to be a supermarket, and they give you, like something that's a stadium in size or something, right? And what my habit early on in my teaching career was to be, just as a habit of language and personality, say, well, might be a little too large, right? And what a student will do with feedback like that is they might snip 10% of it, right? And then you'll get the next iteration and you'll be like, oh, okay, it's still way too large, but you're on the right path, right? And then, the next milestone happens. They might, snip it down another 5%. And then you get to the end, the end of the semester, you get the project back, and you kind of compare the comments you gave at the end versus the comments you gave at the beginning, and you realize you have the same complaints. You're still saying, level's too darn big at the end. And so what I've learned is you have to really demand big changes early, or else the same problems are just going to persist throughout a level. So that would be my recommendation to anyone that's managing level designers or whatever. Don't be afraid to ask for big changes early. That's what the paper design is for. That's what the white box is for. We have these processes so that we can make those big changes without it causing a lot of pain. There hasn't been a lot of art or programming sort of dedicated to the project yet. All right, so guided freedom gets the best results. So this is more of me evangelizing to you about the care and feeding of designers, I guess, more than as a best practice. So, of course, we can't, it's not chaos. You're going to have the needs of your own project. Every project has its own guardrails. But designers, we're right-brain creative people. We like to have freedom. We like to kind of work unimpeded by a lot of micromanaging type of feedback. So once you get those big changes out of the way early, then let your designers work. And what will happen is you'll get more cycles out of them. Designers want to work on their projects. They want to work on their levels. They want to work on them a long time. They want to really crank on them. And the more freedom they have, the more they'll just do that naturally. And I certainly find that to be true with my students. So kit bashing, let's talk a little bit about this, because my students do this, and I think it's actually undervalued a little bit in the industry, this skill. So if you're not familiar with that term, many of you are, I know. It's basically just taking a finished set of art assets and being able to bash an environment out of it, right? So you download some kit from the Unreal Marketplace or Unity Marketplace, and you're able to craft a high-quality environment. So you're not actually making the models or making the art. You're just kind of assembling it, from a Lego kit. So what I've noticed teaching is that you can give two different students the same set of finished art assets, and you'll get totally different results in quality, which has really taught me that this is a skill. Absolutely is a skill. And I actually think the industry should test for this a little more in with level designers, because when you think about what this skill gives you, it gets a ton of mileage out of your art assets. So if you have a level designer that's really good at this, it means that your art will extend farther. You'll get more use out of the art that you're making because your level designers can make more stuff out of it. So I actually think it is really, really valuable to be able to do this. And I could just see with certain students, they have a tremendous ability to take any art that I give them and just kind of make cool environments from them. All right, so the last point I want to make here is to say that just as an overall thing, kind of the purpose of level design is to take, level design doesn't exist on its own, right? You can't just kind of do level design without a game design underneath it, because kind of the purpose of level design is to make the game mechanics more interesting, or as interesting as possible. It's to make the game design as effective as possible. That's really what level design is trying to do, and of course, in a greater sense, is what a lot of the game development disciplines are trying to do, is enhance a game design. But what I see at Purdue is that I can give them, which I do, and we'll see in just a second here, a few projects that do this, where I just give them stock Unreal. I call it an immersive sim level. I used to call it walking simulator, and I think that's too pejorative. So we call it an immersive sim project now. You're just taking stock Unreal, the stock third person, template, and that's all you get. So we're talking triggers, blueprint scripting, that sort of thing. And the better students can actually make really interesting stuff out of that, out of very minimalistic materials. All right, so we're at the Easter egg. All right, so the Easter egg here are some specific examples. This is actually from the first class I ever taught at Purdue, so let's jump right in. All right, so this is from a student named Alex, and it's just kit bashed with a set of low poly, like ruins assets that are on the Unreal Marketplace somewhere. And what I love about this project is it's all just about pushing a block. It's sort of like a Sokoban concept here. And he starts you off in a room that, to get beyond the room, you have to push that block. There's really no other way that you can do it. And I can see the screen resolution's kind of distorting this just a little bit, and then you end up in this kind of grand cathedral, again, just kit bashed with a pretty minimalistic set of assets from the marketplace. And what I love about this is the way you learn that gravity and the pushing of blocks is just the entire point of this, and even if you have no idea what to do, you'll probably just figure it out by walking around. And so you can see that the way he set this up is you kind of go to each area. There's a block there. He worked very hard to make sure you couldn't push the blocks out of the kind of puzzle areas here. And as you progress, you're going to lower that huge boulder, every time you find a pressure plate to push a block on. So, again, kind of simple stuff, but that's, again, stock Unreal. There's no project template here other than the basic first-person template in this case. So now we see the ball drop down a little more, and you can see if you remove it from the pressure plate, it goes back up. So he's going to push it back here. And he does try to progress the simple puzzles every time. This is just from his YouTube video, so For some reason, he felt the need to jump there. He probably narrates it in his original video. And now you have a slightly trickier setup here where you have to push the block through obstacles. Again, really simple stuff, but think about this in the context of maybe an action game where you're doing other things. The ability to be able to kind of script and put together these kinds of simple puzzles are great pace changers in a game that maybe where you're doing something else the whole time. All right, so just again, I love puzzles that kind of are naturalistic. It's sort of like, okay, yes, gravity. We all know how gravity works. Now, yes, probably that ball is heavier in real life, but we'll let that gamism slide. And the fact that, look, here's the thing. There's going to be a harsh camera cut here that'll show eventually, just by the way this level's designed, the ball kind of has to end up in the right area eventually. Yes, and here it is. It's just going to fall into that slot, much like a pinball. And this is a nice use of the Apex destruction plug-in here. And then we progress, and this is kind of the story he's trying to tell, this kind of ethereal scene. All right, so the next project I want to show quickly, because I know I'm starting to run low on time here. This is just a screenshot and just shows the kind of variety of things you get. This is from a student named Emily. She did a kind of a middle school simulation. And I love this, by the way, about teaching in college. You just get these projects that are just so not the norm that you would find in kind of like industry work. So the premise here is that you're a middle schooler and you're trying to deliver some illicit food to another student, like snacks you're not supposed to have. And I helped her kind of implement, again, a really simple stealth mechanic, just using triggers and static character models. The idea is if a teacher sees you, you're warped back to detention. But again, there's no AI, there's no character moving around. And so what she did, and I thought this was very clever to make this interesting, is she would tuck away the teachers kind of in these blind spots in the map. And so if you just run through blindly, you'll hit that kind of line of sight trigger and end up back in detention. But if you take it slow and look around, you'll see them and you'll kind of can see what areas to avoid. So again, just a very simple, elegant kind of solution to getting stealth in without any AI at all. All right, the last project I'll show, this is from a student named Isaiah. This actually is from the deathmatch maps I had them do. It's a good example of, hey, quality documentation equals quality end result. So this isn't his entire document, but just his overall map. And, again, what I like about it is I can play this in my head easily just by looking at this. I see where the weapons are placed. I can see where the obstacles are. I can see, what directions the stairwells go, and I have a clear sense of kind of how this might play in a deathmatch sort of context, which is what you want in a paper map like this. You want to be able to, at least to some degree, play this in your head. And again, he kit bashed this with just the assets that come with the stock Unreal shooter game template. It's like an extra template they have you can download. It has some sci-fi assets, so it's really kit bashed well. And what I like about this is that, he did a good job kind of designing this around a limited weapon set. The template only has the kind of medium-range rifle there and a rocket launcher. So he designed kind of a middle arena, which might be good for long, sort of the rockets and kind of long-range stuff. And he designed hallways around it that have enough visual blockers to kind of provide, kind of sniping opportunities, but without it being so open that you would just get shot around the corner there. So just a few examples of good student work so far. All right, so New Game Plus. Thank you very much for listening to me today. Here's where you can find me on various social medias. This is my podcast, which I'm actually recording this talk for. Thank you, M+Dev folks, who give me permission to do that. So I know we don't have a ton of time, but any questions for me? Yeah.
Will this, I guess, like the slides be available anywhere?
I can make them available on my portfolio site. So I will do that since you requested that. So I'll put that on rohogames.com. Yeah. Yes.
I know you mentioned Yakuza as a good example of building under the world, but can you mention an inspiration from like a classic game and also a modern game?
In terms of the verisimilitude stuff?
Yeah.
All right. Just so on the recording I get this question. This question was, what other games are really great in terms of verisimilitude? So, If we want to go really classic, I think that like maybe the first game I think of that is honestly Adventure on the Atari, because it actually attempts to have a persistent world of sorts that you can move around, and that's as minimalistic as it gets. Actually, I know this may not be a classic game, but one of my favorite games with this is a game Capcom made named Dragon's Dogma, simply because the way they connect the towns together, the way they've structured their game world is there's about 3 or so communities. There's a road that connects them all, and basically the road has NPCs kind of delivering things back and forth, and the road is safe, everything else is not. And so it kind of teaches you as the player that you can kind of traverse and avoid the tougher monsters, but as soon as you leave the road, which doesn't have guards, doesn't have things to help defend you, then that's where you find, and that's such a simple system. Like, it's not as complicated as like an Elder Scrolls game where they've programmed like routines for NPCs that get up and go to work or whatever, however that works. It's such a simple but I think elegant system that makes the world feel logical. Yeah.
I'm kind of personally curious. This is less related to like your particular. Well, I suppose it's a little related to your particular experience, but as you were talking, I noticed that a lot of it seemed to have some sort of overlap with like tabletop gaming, and
right.
I was wondering if you have any experience with that you feel like it seems to me, like as someone who does a lot of tabletop gaming, that there is a lot of overlap in sort of how you want to think about the design and how players are going to interact with it and that sort of thing.
Right. I think there is a lot of overlap, and I have to say, one of the things about your, and again, the question was overlap between tabletop and kind of digital gaming. I think there is a lot of overlap, and one of the things I really regret, and this is one of the things, when you grow up in a town of 2,000 people and one stoplight, as I did, like, I remember buying the 40K set, like the basic set, and painting the figures and being like, I'm going to have Eldar, and be like, who's going to play with me? No one, right? So I didn't get, like, almost everyone I know in gaming has all this pen and paper and tabletop experience, and I missed out on a lot of that because I grew up in the literal middle of nowhere, Ohio. So, right. Any other questions? Yeah, back there.
Just a quick question, because I know like they were made by 2 different studios. I saw on there you were part of the production team that worked on Arkham Origins.
Mm-hmm.
What was your guys' approach to that as like a design studio in general, taking something that was done by another studio and then building upon it? Like, what were your goals? Like, what were you trying to build upon? Like, what were you trying to maybe change? Like, what was your approach to that?
All right, so that question was talking about our work on Arkham Origins as kind of a subcontracted studio with design in particular. It's a really interesting question because, kind of our main job on that was to port the game. So there was a lot of technical things that was outside of my expertise. However, I did work on it, and there were some interesting things that happened on that project. One thing that we did is we helped make a kind of a show floor demo that, they had a demo that was hands off, someone would, from Warner Brothers would control it, and they needed to make it kind of bulletproof for anyone to be able to play. And so it's kind of a different design experience to take like a 15-minute thing, but make it such that any random person can come up to it and play it and have like a decent experience. So you end up doing things like, okay, like we're going to put in a little cutscene to show this door opening so that they know where to go. We're going to do these things to kind of direct the experience while still giving the player a certain amount of freedom. Another thing I remember doing later on is that, like, sometimes you have to. There was several problems that, like, I was familiar with. This would be Unreal Kismet, I think. This was pre-Blueprint stuff, I believe, and occasionally, the engineers in that project would run into some kind of issue where the solution was in the Kismet scripting, and so I'd be kind of called over to kind of help debug that stuff, and that's kind of where I proved, kind of my usefulness in a lot of ways on that is, even though, we have, great programmers that can just dig right into the C++, if they're not familiar with the visual scripting, it's going to be faster for someone like myself to solve the problem. So there's a lot of things like that. All right, other questions? All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming out here and seeing so many familiar faces.
Hey everyone, Rob here. Hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. I just wanted to take a moment to remind you of the easiest ways to support what Kip and I are doing. The easiest way to support us is by subscribing on iTunes, Google Play, or Podbean and leaving a positive review there. You can find us on iTunes and Google Play by searching for the Grid Snaps podcast. You can find us on Podbean simply by going to rohogames.podbean.com. This simple show of support helps us show up higher in searches and will bring our podcast to more people.